What happens when a child, barely 6 years old, faces a test designed to destroy him, and his mother watches, helpless, as her entire world hangs in the balance? There are some people in this world who have everything and feel nothing. Alistair Finch was one of them. He lived in a mansion that looked like something out of a fairy tale, the kind of place most people only see in magazines or dream about when they buy lottery tickets. Crystal chandeliers hung from ceilings so high your voice would echo. Marble floors stretched endlessly, polished so perfectly you could see your reflection staring back at you. Rooms upon rooms filled with paintings worth more than most people earn in a lifetime. A library with leather-bound books that no one ever read. A dining table that could seat 20, where he ate alone. Alistair had made his fortune through shrewd business deals, through buying low and selling high, through knowing exactly when to trust no one. And over the decades, that philosophy had hardened around his heart like cement. He was 73 years old now, with silver hair slicked back, sharp gray eyes that missed nothing, and a mouth that had forgotten how to smile. He had children, 2 of them, grown and living in distant cities. They called twice a year, once on his birthday, once on Christmas. The conversations lasted exactly 7 minutes, filled with polite questions neither party cared to answer. How's business, father?
Fine.
And yours? Fine.
Click.
He had money. He had power. He had respect. But late at night, when the mansion was silent and the shadows grew long, Alistair would sit in his leather chair and feel nothing. An emptiness so vast it seemed to swallow him whole. And somewhere along the way, he decided that this emptiness wasn't his fault. It was theirs. All of them. Every person he'd ever known. Every person who'd ever smiled at him while calculating what they could take. Humanity, he'd concluded, was rotten to the core. People were motivated by one thing, and one thing only: greed. So one crisp autumn morning, Alistair decided to prove it. He called his estate manager and requested a new maid, someone young, someone desperate, someone who wouldn't ask too many questions. Within 2 days, Clara arrived. She was 28 but looked older, the way hardship ages people before their time. Her hands were rough from years of cleaning other people's homes. Her eyes carried the weight of someone who'd learned to expect disappointment. She wore a simple gray dress, her dark hair pulled back in a practical bun, and she clutched a worn purse like it contained her entire world. Because in many ways it did. Clara was a widow. Her husband had died 2 years earlier in a construction accident, a scaffolding collapse that took 3 men and left 3 families shattered. The settlement barely covered the funeral. She had no family, no safety net, just a 6-year-old son named Liam and a series of cleaning jobs that paid just enough to keep them fed.
Barely.
When Alistair's estate manager offered her the position, she'd nearly wept with relief. The pay was more than she'd ever earned. Enough to buy Liam new shoes. Enough to pay the rent without lying awake at night doing impossible math in her head. There was just one problem. "I have a son," she'd said quietly during the interview, her voice trembling. "He's 6. Well-behaved, I promise. Silent as a mouse. But I have no one to watch him during the day. If there's any way." The estate manager had hesitated, then made a phone call. Alistair, listening from his study, had smiled coldly. "Tell her the boy can come," he'd said. "As long as he stays out of sight."
Perfect.
A desperate woman and a child. The setup for his experiment couldn't be better. On Clara's 3rd day of work, Alistair prepared his test. He chose the library, his favorite room, lined with books he'd bought for their impressive spines rather than their content. The fireplace was unlit despite the autumn chill. Late morning light filtered through tall windows, casting long rectangles of gold across the Persian rug. On the mahogany table in the center of the room, Alistair placed an envelope. A thick one. Inside was $10,000 in cash, crisp $100 bills, more money than Clara probably earned in 6 months. He left it there, unsealed, the green edges of the bills clearly visible. Then he settled into his leather armchair, positioned perfectly with a view of the table. He draped a blanket over his legs, tilted his head back, closed his eyes, and waited. His breathing became slow and deep. To anyone entering, he would appear to be sleeping, an old man taking his afternoon rest, unaware of his surroundings. But beneath his eyelids, Alistair Finch was very much awake, watching, waiting for human nature to reveal itself. He didn't have to wait long. The library door creaked open softly. He heard Clara's sharp intake of breath. She'd been instructed to clean this room today, though she didn't know why he'd chosen it specifically. He heard her footsteps, hesitant on the hardwood floor just beyond the rug. And then he heard something else. Smaller footsteps. A child's footsteps. "Liam, sweetheart," Clara whispered, her voice tight with anxiety. "You must sit in that corner. Right there.
Do you see?
Don't move. Don't touch anything. Mr. Finch is sleeping, and if you wake him—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Liam understood what was at stake. At 6 years old, he'd already learned that his mother's jobs were fragile things, easily lost, that their survival depended on her staying invisible, staying perfect, staying employed. "Yes, Mama," came a small voice. So quiet Alistair almost didn't hear it. Through the slits of his eyelids, Alistair watched Clara guide her son to the far corner of the room, near a tall bookshelf. The boy wore clothes that had been mended multiple times, patches on the knees of his jeans, a sweater with sleeves slightly too short. His dark hair needed cutting. His shoes were held together with tape. But his eyes were bright. Curious.
Kind.
Clara knelt down, gripping the boy's shoulders. "I need to get my cleaning supplies from the cart. I'll be right back. 2 minutes, that's all."
Sit here.
"Be silent. Please, Liam. Please." The boy nodded solemnly. Clara cast one more worried glance at her sleeping employer, then at the boy, then at the money on the table, which she clearly noticed but carefully ignored. She slipped out of the room, leaving the door slightly ajar. Alistair waited. His test had begun. For a long moment, Liam sat perfectly still, his back against the bookshelf, his small hands folded in his lap. He looked at the books towering above him. He looked at the fireplace. He looked at the old man sleeping in a chair. And then his gaze landed on the table. On the envelope. Here it comes, Alistair thought with grim satisfaction. The boy would approach. He'd look around nervously. Maybe he wouldn't take all of it. Maybe just one bill, thinking no one would notice. Or maybe he'd grab the whole envelope and stuff it in his pocket. Children were greedy little creatures, after all. They wanted toys, candy, things their parents couldn't afford. But Liam didn't move toward the table. Instead, he tilted his head, studying Alistair with those unsettlingly bright eyes. And then the boy did something unexpected.
He frowned.
It was a small frown, concerned rather than angry. And then Liam stood up, not rushing, not sneaking, just standing, and walked over to where Alistair sat. The old man's heart rate quickened despite himself. What was the boy doing? Liam stood beside the chair, looking down at Alistair's legs beneath the thin blanket. The fireplace was unlit. The room was cool. And the boy, who'd spent his entire young life learning to notice when people were cold or hungry or hurting, recognized something. Without a word, Liam reached up and carefully, so carefully, removed his own sweater. It was threadbare, this sweater. Probably the warmest thing he owned. His mother had bought it at a thrift store last winter, and it was already too small for him. But he took it off anyway. And then, with the gentleness of someone handling something precious, Liam draped his sweater over Alistair's legs, on top of the blanket. His small hands smoothed it out, making sure it covered the old man's knees. Alistair felt the weight of it, felt the warmth of it, warmed by a child's body, given freely. His chest tightened. But Liam wasn't finished. The boy turned toward the table, and for a moment Alistair thought, "Here it is. Now he'll take the money." Instead, Liam noticed that the envelope was positioned carelessly near the edge of the table, as if someone might accidentally knock it to the floor. Next to it was one of Alistair's leather notebooks, also precariously placed. With the same careful gentleness, Liam pushed both items toward the center of the table, away from the edge, where they'd be safe. He glanced at the sleeping old man one more time, and then he whispered, so softly Alistair barely heard it, "Safe now." And then the boy walked back to his corner, sat down against the bookshelf, and wrapped his arms around himself. He was shivering now, without his sweater. But he didn't complain. He just sat there, quiet as a mouse, waiting for his mother to return. Alistair couldn't move. Something had cracked inside his chest, something he'd thought was permanently sealed. His eyes, which had been pretending to sleep, now burned with something he hadn't felt in decades.
Tears.
This child, this poor, hungry, cold child, had seen an old man sleeping and thought only, he might be cold. Let me help. He'd seen money, more money than his family had, and thought only, this might fall. Let me make it safe. Not, what can I take? But, what can I give? The library door opened again. Clara hurried in with her supplies, her eyes immediately darting to the corner where Liam sat shivering. Her face drained of color. "Liam," she whispered frantically, rushing over. "Where's your sweater? What did you—" And then she saw it, draped over the old man's legs. Her hand flew to her mouth. Her eyes went wide with horror. "Oh God," she breathed. "Oh no. No, no, no." She grabbed Liam's hand, pulling him up. She was shaking, terrified, already preparing her apologies, already imagining being thrown out, already calculating how many days until the rent was due and how she'd possibly— "Don't," came a voice from the chair. Clara froze. Alistair Finch opened his eyes. And for the first time in 30 years, he was crying. Clara couldn't breathe. The old man was awake. Worse, he was crying. His sharp gray eyes, which had always seemed so cold, so calculating, were wet with tears that traced slow lines down his weathered cheeks. And he was staring at her son. "Mr. Finch, I'm so sorry," Clara stammered, her voice breaking. "He didn't mean to. He shouldn't have touched. Please, I'll pay for any—" "Stop," Alistair said quietly, raising one trembling hand. Clara's mouth snapped shut. She pulled Liam closer to her side, her arm wrapping around him protectively. The boy looked confused, his small body still shivering without his sweater, his eyes darting between his terrified mother and the crying old man. Alistair reached down and carefully lifted the child's sweater from his legs. He held it for a moment, feeling its weight, its warmth, the worn fabric that had been mended so many times. Then he looked at Liam. "Why?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Why did you give me this?" Liam blinked, uncertain if he was allowed to speak. Clara's grip on his shoulder tightened, but she nodded slightly, giving him permission. "You looked cold, sir," Liam said simply. "The fire isn't on. And my mama says when someone's cold, you help them get warm, even if it means you're cold instead." Something inside Alistair shattered completely. He'd spent 73 years building walls around his heart, convincing himself that people were selfish, that kindness was just another form of manipulation, that generosity always came with strings attached. He designed this test specifically to prove his cynical worldview, to catch this desperate woman or her child in an act of theft, to confirm what he already believed about human nature. Instead, a 6-year-old boy had given him the warmest thing he owned and asked for nothing in return. "Here," Alistair said, standing slowly from his chair. He walked over to Liam and knelt down, his old knees creaking with the effort, until he was eye level with the boy. Gently, he helped Liam put the sweater back on. "You need this more than I do." Liam's face brightened with relief as the warmth surrounded him again. But Alistair wasn't finished. Not even close. Something dark was still moving inside him, some final need to test, to probe, to see if this kindness was real or just a performance. The cynic in him, though wounded, wasn't quite dead yet. He needed to know, would this child's goodness survive under pressure? Or would it crumble like everything else? So Alistair Finch did something terrible. He stood up, his face suddenly hardening. The tears stopped. His jaw set in a grim line. And when he spoke, his voice was cold again, the voice of a man who'd spent decades crushing people in business deals. "Clara," he said sharply, "there's something we need to discuss." Clara's face went pale. Sir? Alistair walked over to his leather chair, an antique piece, worth thousands of dollars, and ran his hand along the armrest. Then he pointed to a barely visible scuff mark on the leather. This chair, he said, his voice hard as stone, is over 200 years old. It's been in my family for generations. And look at this. He traced the small mark with his finger. It's been damaged, ruined. Clara's eyes widened in horror.
I don't understand.
I didn't touch. Your son, Alistair interrupted, turning to look at Liam with cold accusation. I saw him. When he came over here, he brushed against the chair. That mark wasn't there before. It was a lie. The scuff had been there for months. Alistair had barely noticed it until now. But Clara didn't know that. And neither did Liam. No, Clara whispered, tears springing to her eyes. Please, Mr. Finch, he didn't mean to. He's just a child. I'll pay for it. However long it takes, I'll work it off. Please don't. The repair will cost at least $500, Alistair said flatly. Maybe more. $500. 6 months of groceries. 3 months of rent. An impossible sum. Clara's legs seemed to give out. She sank down onto her knees, her hands clasped together like she was praying. Please, she begged, tears streaming down her face now. Please, I need this job. We have nowhere else to go. I'll do anything. I'll work extra hours. I'll clean every room twice. Just please. Mama, don't cry. Liam's small voice cut through the room like a knife. The boy stepped forward, placing himself between his mother and Alistair. His chin was trembling, but he held it up as high as he could. His small hands were balled into fists at his sides, not in anger, but in determination. It's my fault, Liam said, his voice wavering but clear. I did it. Mama shouldn't be punished. Liam, no. Clara reached for him, but he stepped forward again. I'll pay for it, the boy said, looking up at Alistair with those impossibly bright eyes that were fighting back tears, but refusing to let them fall. Alistair's throat tightened. You'll pay for it? And how exactly will you do that? Liam stood there for a moment thinking. His small face was so serious, so determined. And then his expression changed. A flash of pain crossed his features, there and gone in an instant. He'd thought of something. Something that hurt. Wait here, Liam whispered. The boy ran to the corner where he'd been sitting. He knelt down beside his mother's worn purse and pulled out a small backpack, the kind children take to school, covered in faded superhero stickers. He unzipped it with trembling fingers and reached inside. When he stood up and walked back over, he was holding something in both hands, carrying it like it was made of glass. It was a toy car, but not just any toy car. This one had clearly been loved for years. The red paint was chipped and faded. One of the wheels was missing. The windshield was cracked. Part of the roof had been glued back on so many times the glue showed white against the plastic. It was, by any objective measure, worthless. But the way Liam held it, the way his whole body seemed to curve protectively around it, told a different story. This was my daddy's, Liam said quietly, holding the car up to Alistair. His voice was shaking now, the tears finally spilling over. He gave it to me before he went to heaven. He said it was his when he was little. He said it was special. Clara made a sound, a broken, desperate sound.
Liam, no.
Baby, no, you don't have to. It's all I have, Liam continued, still holding the car out toward Alistair. But you can have it. To pay for the chair. It's really special, I promise. My daddy loved it. And I love it too.
But, his voice cracked.
But Mama needs her job. So you can have it. The boy's small hands were shaking. Tears ran down his cheeks. Every part of him was screaming not to let go of this precious thing, this last physical connection to his father, this treasure he slept with every night, this broken toy that represented every bedtime story, every piggyback ride, every I love you from a man who would never say those words again.
And yet,
he was willing to give it up. For his mother. Without hesitation. Alistair Finch stood there, staring at this 6-year-old boy offering up his most prized possession, and something inside him didn't just crack, it exploded. Every wall he'd ever built, every cynical belief he'd ever held, every bitter thought he'd ever had about human nature, all of it shattered. Because this child, who had nothing, was willing to give everything. This child, who had every reason to be selfish, to protect what little joy he had left in the world, was choosing love over loss. This child was teaching a 73-year-old man what it meant to be human. Alistair's knees buckled. He sank down to the floor, his expensive suit crumpling, and he pulled Liam into his arms. The old man who hadn't hugged anyone in 30 years held this trembling boy against his chest and wept like his heart was breaking. Because it was. And because, for the first time in decades, it was also healing. "Forgive me," Alistair sobbed into Liam's hair. "Oh God, forgive me." Liam stood frozen in the embrace, confused and frightened, still clutching his father's car. Clara was on her feet now, equally confused, her body tense and ready to grab her son and run if she needed to. Alistair pulled back, his hands on Liam's shoulders, his tear-streaked face level with the boy's. "The chair is fine," he said, his voice raw. "There's no damage." It was a lie. A horrible, cruel lie. Clara gasped. "What?" "I was testing you," Alistair confessed, the words pouring out now. "Both of you. I'm a bitter old fool who convinced himself that people are only good when it benefits them. So I left money on that table. I pretended to sleep. I wanted to catch you stealing. I wanted to prove that everyone, even a desperate mother, even an innocent child, would choose greed when given the chance." He looked at Liam, fresh tears falling. "But you didn't take the money. You gave me your sweater. You made sure my things were safe. And when I lied and accused you, you offered me the most precious thing you own." Alistair's voice broke completely. "You have every right to hate me. Both of you. I'm a monster." The room fell silent except for Alistair's ragged breathing. And then Liam did something that completed the old man's transformation. The boy stepped forward and gently placed his broken toy car in Alistair's hands. "You can still have it," Liam said softly. "If you want it. Not for the chair. Just because you're sad. And my daddy used to say that when someone's sad, you should give them something that makes you happy. Maybe it'll help." Alistair stared at the toy car in his hands. This worthless, priceless, broken, perfect thing. And he understood, finally, what wealth actually meant. It wasn't the mansion. It wasn't the money on the table. It wasn't the antique furniture or the paintings or the business empire. It was this. The willingness to give what you treasured most to ease someone else's pain. "No," Alistair said gently, carefully placing the car back in Liam's hands. "This belongs with you. But I wonder." He looked up at Clara, who was watching this entire scene with wide, disbelieving eyes. "I wonder if you both might let me make amends for my cruelty." "Sir, you don't need to." "Please," Alistair interrupted. "Let an old fool try to be better." What happened next changed everything. Alistair didn't just apologize. He didn't just give them a bonus or forgive some imagined debt. He did something far more radical. He invited them into his life. Clara continued working at the mansion, but now with a salary 3 times what she'd been promised. Liam was not only allowed to come to work with his mother, he was welcomed, encouraged. A room was set up for him with books and art supplies. When school started, Alistair hired a driver to take him there and back. But more than that, something unexpected began to bloom in that cold, empty mansion. Friendship. Alistair, who hadn't smiled in years, found himself laughing at Liam's jokes. The boy would draw pictures and present them to the old man like they were masterpieces, and Alistair would hang them on his refrigerator with actual pride. They'd spend afternoons in the library, the same library where the test had taken place, reading books together. Alistair teaching Liam about history and mathematics. Liam teaching Alistair about joy and wonder. On Liam's 7th birthday, Alistair threw him a party. A real party, with a magician and a cake the size of a car tire and more presents than the boy knew what to do with. But the gift Liam treasured most was the one Alistair gave him privately, away from the other children. A glass display case, custom made, with a small velvet cushion inside. For your father's car, Alistair explained, his voice gentle. So, it's always safe. Always honored. Always remembered. Liam had hugged him so hard that Alistair thought his ribs might crack. Years passed like this. Liam grew from a small boy into a teenager, and Alistair grew from a bitter old man into something resembling a grandfather. Clara watched this transformation with quiet amazement, occasionally catching Alistair staring at her son with an expression of such profound love that it made her chest ache. The old man's actual children noticed the change too. They started calling more often, suddenly interested now that their father seemed happy. But Alistair saw through it. They wanted to secure their inheritance. They wanted to make sure this Maid's son wasn't stealing what they believed was rightfully theirs. Alistair, who'd once thought exactly like them, now saw how ugly that thinking was. When Alistair turned 82, his health began to fail. His heart, that heart that had been frozen for so long and then thawed by a child's kindness, was finally giving out. The doctors gave him months, maybe a year. He called his lawyer. 3 months later, on a quiet Tuesday morning in spring, Alistair Finch passed away in his sleep. Clara found him in his favorite leather chair in the library, a book open on his lap, a peaceful expression on his face. At the funeral, the church was full. Business associates, society friends, people who'd known Alistair Finch, the titan of industry. They spoke about his business acumen, his shrewd investments, his impressive estate. But only one person spoke about who he'd become. Liam, now 17 years old, stood at the podium with tears streaming down his face and told a story about a broken toy car and an old man who'd learned that the richest thing you can give someone is yourself. The reading of the will came a week later. Alistair's children sat in the lawyer's office, confident and expectant. They'd done the math. The estate was worth millions. Split 2 ways. They'd each walk away set for life. Clara and Liam sat in the corner, uncomfortable in this world of expensive suits and legal proceedings. They'd come because they'd been specifically requested to attend, but they assumed it was just a formality. Maybe Alistair had left Liam a small trust fund for college. That would be generous. That would be more than enough. The lawyer cleared his throat and began to read. Alistair Finch, being of sound mind. The legal language went on for several minutes. Clara's attention drifted. She was thinking about the funeral, about how empty the mansion would feel now, about what job she'd need to find next. And then she heard Liam's name. And therefore I leave the entirety of my estate, including all properties, investments, and liquid assets, to Liam Carter, with Clara Carter appointed as trustee until he reaches the age of 25. The room exploded. Alistair's children were on their feet, shouting, demanding explanations. Their lawyers were scrambling. Papers were flying. Someone was threatening to contest the will. But Clara couldn't hear any of it. Her ears were ringing. Liam was gripping her hand so hard it hurt, his eyes wide with shock. There's more, the lawyer said loudly, waiting for the room to quiet. Mr. Finch left specific instructions that a letter be read aloud. The letter is addressed to Liam. With shaking hands, the lawyer unfolded a piece of paper. And he read, My dear Liam, if you're hearing this, then I've finally shuffled off this mortal coil, as they say. Good riddance, I was getting tired anyway. I imagine my children are making quite a scene right now. They're probably calling me senile, claiming you manipulated me, threatening legal action. Let them. They have enough money from their trust funds to live comfortably. They'll survive. But you need to understand why I'm doing this. When you were 6 years old, you gave me your sweater.
Such a small thing, really.
A threadbare piece of cloth that probably cost $2 at a thrift store. But in that moment, that gesture meant more to me than every dollar I'd ever earned. Because you saw a stranger, a cold, cruel stranger, and your first instinct was to help.
Not to take.
Not to judge. Not to look away.
To help.
You gave me back something I'd lost decades ago. Something I thought was gone forever, buried under years of bitterness and cynicism and greed. You gave me back my soul. Over these past years, watching you grow, I've learned what it means to be truly wealthy. It's not about bank accounts or properties or investments. It's about love. It's about kindness. It's about being willing to give your last sweater to someone who needs warmth. You already know this. You've always known this. You're richer than I ever was, even when I had nothing. So, I'm giving you this fortune not because you need it, though I hope it makes your life easier, but because I know you'll use it the way wealth should be used.
To help people.
To make the world a little warmer. To be the kind of person who gives their sweater to strangers. My children will hate you for this. I'm sorry for that. But I know you're strong enough to handle it. Thank you, Liam, for teaching an old fool how to be human again. Thank you for every drawing, every laugh, every afternoon in the library. Thank you for letting me be the grandfather I never was to my own grandchildren. Use this money well. But remember, the real fortune is who you are, not what you have. With all my love, Alistair. P.S. I had a case made for your father's car. It's in the library. Take it with you. Some treasures don't have price tags. By the time the lawyer finished reading, there wasn't a dry eye in the room, except for Alistair's children, who'd already stormed out. Clara was sobbing openly now, her hand over her mouth. Liam sat frozen, tears running down his face, staring at nothing. He loved us, the boy whispered. He really loved us. He did, Clara said, pulling her son into her arms. And you saved him, baby. You saved him. 10 years later, Liam Carter stood in the same library where the story began. The mansion was different now. No longer cold and empty, it had been transformed into a youth center, a place where kids from struggling families could come after school for tutoring, meals, art classes, and a safe place to just be kids. The walls were covered with children's drawings. The rooms echoed with laughter. Liam, now 27, ran the center himself. He'd used Alistair's fortune to create similar centers across the state. He'd established scholarships. He'd funded meals for hungry families. He'd done exactly what Alistair knew he would do. On the mantel above the fireplace, the same fireplace that had been unlit that autumn day, sat a glass case. Inside, resting on a velvet cushion, was a broken red toy car with a missing wheel and a cracked windshield. Next to it was a worn child sweater. And beneath both items was a small plaque that read, "The richest gifts are the ones given from an empty pocket to a full heart." Liam stood there, as he did every morning, and touched the glass gently. "Thank you," he whispered, to his father, to Alistair, to everyone who taught him that true wealth isn't found in gold. It's found in the willingness to give your last sweater to someone who's cold. It's found in offering your most precious treasure to ease someone's pain. It's found in kindness. And that kind of wealth, that's the kind that can never run out.